All right, so we are going to wrap up the Victorian era by talking about two very important isms that we want to get into here, and this is first wave feminism and anti-Semitism. And we want to make sure that we give them our due attention. Now, and it'll be a shorter lecture. The last couple have been, a little bit longer, but we've talked about some really important things, and it's still very important. But there's this cultural conflict going on that we've talked about between the strict, rigid gender roles and the pseudoscience and all these things that are used to kind of keep white males at the top end of society. And so we're going to kind of give you a helpful definition here of feminism that historians Bonnie Anderson and Judith Sensor kind of say that feminism asserts the claim that women are fully human, not secondary or inferior to men, that women have been oppressed throughout history, and that women must recognize their solidarity with other women in order to end that oppression and create a more just and equitable society. There is your definition of feminism, okay? Very, very concise, very, very clear. Now, this does go back centuries, at least, to Mary Wollstonecraft and her very specific work on feminism that demanded for the equality in voting rights and education and things like that. And that's all been a part of this call for equality during the American and French revolutions during the late 18th century. But somehow, that never really got fully extended to women. Although some women, of course, did become very influential. There were many women that, even following the American Revolution, that were very instrumental in kind of shaping our country, even though they had to kind of do it from behind the curtain, I guess, in the ways that they led their husbands. We know that, like Jane Addams, the wife of John Adams, or is it Abigail Adams? Not Jane Addams. That's Whole House. Abigail Adams. Sorry. I'm sorry. It's early. She was very influential with her husband. And so, wow, that was embarrassing. So you have this first wave feminism movement that's going to emerge and champions women's rights during this Victorian era that is emphasizing these gender distinctions and separate spheres to an almost absurd degree. In the context of the Victorian era, most Europeans believed that these separate spheres were almost like doctrine. Almost, they held them with a religious fervor. Women have to look a certain way and dress a certain way and do certain things at the home, and the man is supposed to look a certain way and dress a certain way, and he's supposed to do all the stuff around town and go to work. And it's argued at the time that men and women each had very useful and necessary roles to play, but that they were very distinct from one another. And the classic model is, the man is going to represent the family in public and make decisions that affect the family, while women maintain order in the home and raise the children. Although, husbands also had basically veto power over anything his wife did, the husband was to owe his wife protection from the world, and the wife was to owe her husband obedience. And these are very old ideas, and they were implemented into a lot of the legal systems, which officially classified women with children, as basically non-existent outside of their husbands once they were married. They had no legal identity. And they could be, if you were a woman who had children and, left her husband, you would literally be considered legally insane. Like, how can you be so crazy to think you could do this by yourself, right? And so they couldn't initiate divorce. They couldn't vote. They could not have custody of their children were they to be divorced by their husbands. The fathers would get the children. They could not pursue higher education. They couldn't have their own bank accounts, so they had no access to or control of money. They weren't allowed to initiate lawsuits. They could also not serve as legal witnesses. So if you were a woman and you witnessed a crime, you had to tell your husband about it, and he would have to testify in court. You weren't even allowed, like, you could witness a murder. And then they'd be like, who was the only witness? And they'd be like, well, this lady saw it. And they're like, great, nobody saw it. Think about that, right? And so there's a difference, this lack of rights. And I'm not saying that women, it is very noble in my mind if a woman chooses to stay home and raise children. My own mother did that. She was a trained phlebotomist, so she was not a nurse, but could draw blood and worked in the hospital. And then when her and my dad had kids, she decided that she would be a stay-at-home mom. And she did that until basically all of us were in high school. And then she slowly decided, I want to go back to work. And she would do subbing and stuff like that before, but she decided, I want to go back to work once we got into high school. And that's very noble. If you decide that that's what you want to do, that's wonderful. But for it to be a thing that is forced and expected is a whole different story. And so I think that's a very, we had a very different problem. This was, you had no other choice. This is what women did. So first wave feminism is going to stand against this discrimination. They were specifically interested initially in property laws and the amount of control that women could wield over their children within the family, and of course the all-important right to vote. So it's a defining characteristic is this idea of standing against discrimination in these three ways. And I think the right to vote becomes probably the most famous. Certainly women at the time, in the first wave feminists would, say, the right to vote, that's the one we associate the most. But I would probably say that women at the time would argue that they were only inferior and considered inferior because they weren't allowed to get educated to the same degree. If you really think about what was the justification for saying women couldn't vote, they'd say, well, they're just not smart enough. They don't have enough education to understand all the complexities of voting and all this stuff. So for a woman, you go, well, I'm capable of learning more. If you would let me get educated, I could show you that I'm smart enough to vote, right? The other two are really what kept the inability to vote in place. So while they're pushing for the right to vote, the idea of being able to have more control over your family and the more education really are going to be what leads to eventually people going, well, why aren't we letting women vote? They're clearly capable of doing so. They also wanted economic independence. They wanted the right to be able to have their own money. And, it was really hard because biologists, again, would routinely claim that due to pseudoscience, they would say, look, we have these scientific studies that show that women are just not smart. They're just not even biologically capable of being smart as a man is, which is insane. And so, you also have these very sexist claims that, women just can't do these things. They're too frail. They're not mentally capable of understanding the stresses that it takes to be a part of society outside the home. It's better to just put them in the home and they take care of the kids and they're more gentle. And if you let them go out in the real world and experience all the mean things out there, they're just going to fall apart. They're just going to have mental breakdowns because they can't handle it. They're just not strong enough. And then they back that up with pseudoscience. And so, one example was, in the inaugural address of a new female scientist at the University of Athens in the early 1900s. There is this woman who is interrupted by the male students in the back of the room. And so she's a scientist. She's got this job at the University of Athens. And she goes to make a speech, and literally she can't finish her speech because there's men in the back of the room screaming at her, go back to the kitchen, make me a sandwich. Where's your kids at? I can't believe you're abandoning your family. Right? Why should I listen to you? You're not smart enough to know all these things. Did a man write that speech for you? And she had to stop speaking. Even Queen Victoria herself, which this era is named after, she's the queen, once said that the demand for equal rights for women was, quote, a mad, wicked folly, forgetting every sense of womanly feelings and propriety. So the queen herself was against equal rights for women. All right, and it's kind of crazy. Now, in the response, hold on, I think I missed a slide in here somewhere. It's okay. Education, they got their right to vote, economic independence. And, women's suffrage is founded on capital movements that spread across the continent of Europe over the next 3 decades. The word feminism only comes about really in the 1890s, so the movement is going to go on for several decades before we have them turn to their struggle to vote. And then that also gets tied in with a lot of other campaigns. Suffrage is seen as a big component to make women equal, but not the main component necessarily. And so they're basically, again, they need the economic independence more than anything else. Now, so you have these things that are really, that's really the main ideas here within this. Unfortunately, there's another sort of problematic thing that's going on in the pre-World War I era. It's called anti-Semitism. As we get into World War I and obviously World War II, anti-Semitism is going to be extremely problematic, being, the root of the Holocaust. And so we're talking about that in the coming weeks, but Jews have been a part of European society ever since the Roman Empire. And in the Middle Ages, they were frequently persecuted and expelled and massacred by the majority around them, which was usually Christian. Jews were accused of being responsible for the death of Christ, even though it was a combination of, the Jews arresting him and then the Romans actually executing him. But, that's nuance that takes too long to really think about. It's easier just to blame the Jews for all the problems. And we've talked about this throughout, last semester and this semester. They were blamed for the bubonic plague because some of their Jewish customs prevented them from maybe being exposed in the same way that other people were, right? They were seen as practitioners of black magic. So this anti-Semitism is just prejudice against Jews, and it's been very strong in Europe for really centuries and millennium. And then you have this thing called the Dreyfus Affair. And it's going to take place in France in the 1890s. You have a man named Richard Dreyfus, he's Jewish. He is a military official, and he is framed for espionage. And he's stripped of his rank and imprisoned. And then you have this enormous public debate that breaks out in French society over whether he's actually guilty or innocent. And it really revolves around the idea. The main argument is that he is a French Jew. And the question becomes, is that possible? Do the Jews actually ever see themselves as anything before they are Jewish? So they go, well, he's a French Jew. And they go, there's no such thing as a French Jew. You can have a Jew that lives in France, but they'll never truly identify as being French because their identity as a Jew is far more important to them. Now, that is just racist, right? The idea that Jewish people can't be nationalist for their country is absolutely insane. But that's kind of the argument. They say that Jewish people are inherently predisposed to lie and cheat, and so he must be guilty because he's a Jew. You can see the obvious. And the Dreyfus, the people that are against him argue that, French citizens can't be Jews. Ultimately, though, this Dreyfus affair is going to exonerate him. He is released from prison, and he's proven that the charges were made up, that he was framed, but not before this anti-Semitism is really elevated to one of the major characteristics of the far-right conservative movement in Europe. In France, some educated European Jews conclude that the pursuit of not just legal equality, but cultural acceptance is going to be doomed, that they are never going to be culturally accepted as Jews in France or in Europe as a whole. And they decide they're going to start a new movement. They're going to try and establish a new Jewish homeland, which is eventually going to become Israel. But that's not going to happen until after World War II. And so you have what's called Zionism, which is the idea that European Jews are going to return to their homeland and start their own kind of country. Problem is they don't have a country right now. They haven't had a country in Israel since the Crusades, essentially. Really, even before that, the Romans. There has not been a Jewish nation of Israel since the Romans conquered them. I mean, you're talking, at this point, almost 2,000 years. They go, well, we're going to go back. Well, there's already people living there called the Palestinians, and this is not going to end up very well for anybody because, as you know, they're still fighting about it. But once you get to the end of World War II, and we'll talk about how that kind of came about, but it's going to lead to tons of issues in the Middle East, and anti-Semitism is going to continue to be very, very strong throughout this. So to wrap up the Victorian era, it's an impact and conclusions. The positives, there's a lot of positives, but there's certainly a lot of negatives during this time. Positives, you have the growth of science, right? You have the innovation of mass culture. You have first wave feminism that's going to really push equality for everyone. And there's an overall increase in education for everyone. Remember, the literacy is going to go through the roof pretty much worldwide, or in Europe and the Americas. But you also have the rise of pseudoscience on the negative side. You end up with lots of class conflicts, racism, sexism. The bourgeoisie and the nobility and the wealthy are going to end up in a conflict against the poor. And this is going to give rise to socialism and communism and some of these ideas that say, hey, the lower classes are not worse than you. We're not inferior to you just because of how we're born or what class we're born in. And there's going to be a lot of national rivalries that are going to prop up during this Victorian era that are really going to eventually lead us into the World War I, World War II era of history. And those problems that we see mount into that are really formed here in this Victorian era and moving forward. So that's going to wrap up this module, and I hope everybody had a good time learning about Victorian era. And luckily, we know that this has gone a lot, we've come a long way from these ideas. And thank you.